In a tense moment in the skies, the world witnessed a dangerous encounter when a Russian Su-35s fighter jet locked onto a U.S. B-1B Lancer bomber, a strategic asset of the U.S. Air Force. This incident, which unfolded in international airspace, occurred as both nations continued to project military power and influence across critical regions. The Russian jet, equipped with advanced radar systems and air-to-air missile technology, was able to track the U.S. bomber as it conducted routine operations in a contested area. For the U.S. military, the presence of a Russian fighter locking onto their aircraft was a major provocation. The B-1 bomber, designed for high-speed, long-range missions, is capable of carrying both conventional and nuclear payloads, making it a highly valuable asset in maintaining U.S. air superiority. As the Su-35s locked onto the B-1, it signaled more than just a technical achievement for the Russian jet. It represented an escalation in the already tense dynamics between the two nuclear powers. On board the B-1, the crew was well prepared for such encounters. The Air Force had anticipated the possibility of being targeted, given the increasing confrontations between U.S. and Russian military forces in recent years. However, this moment was different. The lock-on was not a simple case of aggressive posture. It was an act of calculation, meant to send a message. The Russian military wanted the U.S. to know that their aircraft were being closely watched and that Russia was ready to engage if needed. As the U.S. crew observed the lock-on, they maintained their operational procedures, keeping calm in the face of the threat. They had practiced these situations many times, but in the back of their minds, the question lingered. Would this encounter escalate into something more dangerous? Would Russia make the next move? Or would it be the U.S. military that would have to respond? As the Russian Su-35s continued to track the U.S. B-1 bomber, the situation became increasingly critical. The Russian pilot, trained for high-stakes encounters, knew that the B-1 bomber was an important target, a symbol of U.S. air superiority. Locking onto the bomber was not just an act of defiance, it was a signal that Russia was monitoring U.S. military movements closely and was ready to take action if necessary. For the U.S. crew on board the B-1, the situation was familiar but no less tense. The bomber, designed for rapid, high-altitude missions, had a variety of defense systems that were activated in response to the threat. The plane's radar systems began to counter the Russian jet's targeting lock, sending signals to its countermeasure systems. But it wasn't just about technology, it was about timing and judgment. The crew had to decide whether to respond with defensive maneuvers or continue the mission as planned, all while knowing the risk of escalating into a full-scale confrontation. As the minutes ticked by, military analysts and commanders at the Pentagon monitored the situation closely. They understood that these moments were a test of U.S. military resolve and operational readiness. Any misstep in such a volatile environment could lead to unpredictable consequences. The U.S. Air Force, already stretched across multiple theaters of conflict, had to balance deterrence with caution, knowing that Russia's military moves in the region had been growing bolder over the years. Back in Russia, military leadership observed the standoff as a statement of strength. The Su-35s, a fourth-generation fighter with advanced air-to-air and air-to-ground capabilities, was capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Its role in this encounter was not just defensive, it was a declaration that Russia's air forces could challenge U.S. assets in the region, and that the Russian military was prepared for any escalation. But even as the Russian pilot held the lock, the broader question remained: would this encounter remain a game of aerial cat and mouse, or was it the prelude to something more significant? As the lock-on from the Russian Su-35s persisted, the U.S. crew on board the B-1B bomber remained alert but composed. In this tense moment, every second counted. The B-1, equipped with state-of-the-art countermeasures, was designed to survive encounters like this. However, the crew knew that in situations like these, the outcome was often determined by timing, precision, and the ability to make the right call under pressure. The crew of the B-1 was well versed in responding to such threats, having undergone rigorous training for high-risk encounters like this one. Their next moves were critical. The first response was defensive, maneuvering, subtle but necessary evasive actions designed to throw off the Russian radar lock. These maneuvers would test the B-1's agility and the crew's ability to react swiftly under pressure. In Washington, the Pentagon was closely monitoring the unfolding situation. Commanders had long anticipated such confrontations with Russia, particularly in contested airspaces near Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where U.S. and Russian military interests often collided. The decision-makers in Washington now faced a dilemma: escalate the situation or maintain composure and avoid a military confrontation. The potential for escalation was high, and the military leadership understood that one wrong move could ignite a larger conflict. A delicate balance was required to ensure U.S. interests were protected while avoiding unnecessary aggression. Meanwhile, the crew on board the B-1 was given the green light to initiate their countermeasures. Electronic warfare systems were activated, designed to confuse and mislead the Russian radar lock. The B-1 began deploying decoy signals, attempting to create false targets and jam the incoming missile systems. The plan was clear: use the technology at their disposal to neutralize the threat without a shot being fired. The B-1 was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a strategic asset that relied on its technological superiority to outmaneuver its adversaries. As the crew executed their evasive maneuvers, the Su-35s pilot held the lock, but the situation was becoming increasingly tense. The Russian pilot knew that if the B-1 continued to evade the lock or deploy countermeasures effectively, the situation could spiral out of control. The U.S. military, despite its technological advantage, was under increasing pressure to handle the situation with care. In this moment, military technology, timing, and judgment were the key factors in determining the outcome of this high-stakes standoff. As the seconds passed, the tension reached its peak. The U.S. B-1 bomber, expertly maneuvering through the air and deploying its countermeasures, was doing everything it could to avoid escalating the situation further. The Russian Su-35s, though persistent, was beginning to realize that the U.S. had anticipated this kind of confrontation. Despite its advanced radar and missile locking technology, the Su-35s found it increasingly difficult to maintain a solid lock on the B-1 as the bomber's countermeasures and evasive maneuvers continued to confuse the radar systems. Inside the cockpit of the Russian fighter, the pilot knew that this was a critical moment. While the B-1 bomber was still within striking range, it was clear that any attempt to fire on the U.S. aircraft could have catastrophic consequences. The Russian military, fully aware of the geopolitical risks, had to decide whether to push forward with the engagement or back off before the situation escalated beyond control. As the U.S. process, military continued to monitor the lock-on. The crew of the B-1 was instructed to maintain their defensive measures and avoid making any provocative moves. The Russian pilot, realizing the potential consequences of escalating the situation, slowly began to disengage. The decision was not easy. Russia had sent a strong message with this aggressive move, but the reality of engaging the U.S. in a full-scale confrontation was too dangerous. The Su-35s began to break off its pursuit, retreating into the skies, its radar system still tracking the B-1, but without the direct targeting lock it had previously maintained. The de-escalation of this standoff marked a significant moment in modern aerial warfare. Both sides had displayed remarkable restraint in the face of what could have been a disastrous escalation. The Russian pilot's decision to back off was a testament to the careful calculations involved in such high-stakes confrontations. The U.S. Navy and Air Force, for their part, had successfully navigated a potential military crisis without resorting to violence, proving that in modern warfare, avoiding conflict is just as important as engaging it. In the aftermath, both nations sought to contain the fallout. The U.S. issued a statement reiterating its commitment to maintaining peace while defending its assets in international airspace. Russia, while backing off from direct confrontation, made it clear that it would continue to monitor U.S. military movements and assert its presence in contested regions. The message from both sides was unmistakable. Military power and technology had played their part, but it was diplomacy and the willingness to retreat that had ultimately prevented a larger conflict.